Sarah's fingers traced the outline of the USB drive beneath her sweater as she stared at the acceptance letter to Millbrook Academy. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Honey, when you see numbers that don't add up, that's not a mistake. That's a choice." She hadn't understood what he meant then. Thomas Thompson, forensic accountant for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, had a way of turning everything into a lesson about following the money trail. Even bedtime stories became tutorials about how shell companies worked, how insurance fraud operated, how people in white coats could steal millions while pretending to heal. That was before the car accident, before the funeral where half the people were federal agents, and the other half were her mother's nursing friends who whispered about how Thomas had been getting threatening calls before he died. "Sarah, you're going to love it there," her stepfather Mark said, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He taught middle school history, drove a 10-year-old Honda, and had married into a family still drowning in medical debt from Thomas's final hospital stay. The insurance company had found reasons to deny most of the claims, pre-existing conditions. They said, experimental treatments, they claimed. Her father, who had spent his career chasing healthcare fraudsters, had died watching his own family get destroyed by the system he'd tried to protect. The USB drive contained his final case files. Sarah had found it in his desk drawer, along with a note, "For Sarah, when you're old enough to understand what justice really costs." If you're feeling that rush of what's going to happen next, hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these stories. And if you want to share where you're watching from, drop it in the comments below. For those who want to support more stories like this one, there's a thanks button right under this video. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps me bring you more inspiring tales of courage and standing up for what's right. Thank you for being here. Now, let's see what happens when push comes to shove. She was 17 now, 3 months after her mother's remarriage. 3 months after they'd moved to Massachusetts so Mark could take a teaching position. 3 months after her whole world had shifted from middle-class suburban comfort to scholarship kid survival mode. Millbrook Academy rose from manicured hills like something from a movie about old money and older secrets. The acceptance letter had arrived with a full scholarship offer that seemed too good to be true. Complete tuition, room and board, even a clothing allowance. The benefactor wished to remain anonymous, but the paperwork bore the letterhead of Wellington Medical Group. Sarah's first day began in advanced placement chemistry, where she sat in the back row watching students casually discuss spring break trips to Europe and summer internships at their parents' companies. The girl next to her, Madison, was explaining to her friend how her mother's new wellness clinic was performing cutting-edge treatments that insurance was finally starting to cover properly. "The billing codes are super specific now," Madison said, checking her manicured nails. "My mom says they're getting like 97% approval rates on claims. It's amazing how much money insurance companies will pay when you know the right medical terminology." Sarah's father had taught her that 97% approval rates in healthcare were either incredibly good doctoring or incredibly sophisticated fraud. She pressed her fingers against the USB drive, feeling its familiar weight. The classroom door opened, and conversation stopped. Christopher Wellington III walked in like he owned not just the room, but everyone in it, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident posture that came from never being told no in any meaningful way. His blazer fit perfectly. His shoes probably cost more than Mark's monthly salary. And when he smiled, it was the practiced expression of someone who had learned early that charm was the best weapon. "Sorry I'm late, Mrs. Patterson," he said. not sounding sorry at all. Family business meeting ran long. You know how hospital board meetings can be. Mrs. Patterson just nodded and gestured toward an empty seat. Sarah watched this interaction with the trained eye her father had given her, recognizing the casual display of power and influence. In this world, being late because of hospital board meetings wasn't a problem. It was a status symbol. Christopher's gaze swept the room and landed on Sarah. She saw the moment he catalogued her thrift store sweater, her generic backpack, the careful way she'd styled her hair to hide the fact that it hadn't been professionally cut in months. "New student," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Scholarship." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah felt 20 pairs of eyes turn toward her, weighing and measuring. She knew she could lie, could pretend her family had money, could try to blend in. But her father had also taught her that lies created more problems than truth. "Yes," she said simply. Christopher's smile widened. "What's your name?" "Sarah Thompson." "Thompson." He seemed to roll the name around in his mouth, testing it. "Any relation to Thomas Thompson?" "The IRS guy who died last year." The classroom fell silent. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. How did Christopher Wellington know about her father? "He was my dad," she said, her voice steady, despite the sudden thundering of her heart. "Right," Christopher said, settling into his seat with the satisfaction of a cat who'd found a particularly interesting mouse. "I remember now. My father mentioned something about that case. Healthcare fraud investigation. Wasn't it lot of accusations? Not much evidence. Shame how that all ended." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat loudly. "If we could focus on chemistry now—" But Sarah couldn't focus on anything except the implication in Christopher's words. Not much evidence. Her father had died with files full of evidence. Medical billing irregularities, phantom patients, insurance claims for procedures that never happened. She'd seen the spreadsheets, the bank records, the careful documentation that showed millions of dollars flowing through shell companies connected to private hospitals. After class, Christopher appeared beside her locker like he'd materialized from thin air. "Sarah Thompson," he said, leaning against the metal door with casual ownership of space. "Daughter of a dead federal accountant, stepdaughter of a middle school teacher, recipient of anonymous charity from our fine institution. Tell me, do you know who provided your scholarship?" Sarah's throat felt tight. The letter said the benefactor wanted to remain anonymous. "Wellington Medical Group," Christopher said, watching her face carefully. "My family's company. We provide a lot of funding to Millbrook, especially for deserving cases like yours." The way he said deserving made it sound like a challenge. "Students from challenging backgrounds who need a leg up. We believe in charity." He reached into his blazer and pulled out a folded paper. "Speaking of which, I run a student organization called Students Care Foundation. We organize charity events, raise money for disadvantaged families, really make a difference in the community. Annual charity prom, charity auctions, charity drives. Very rewarding work." Sarah took the paper automatically, scanning the professional letterhead and polished language about giving back to those less fortunate. "I'd love to have you involved," Christopher continued. "After all, you understand what it's like to need help. That perspective could be valuable. Plus, it looks great on college applications. Stanford loves charitable involvement, especially from scholarship recipients who've overcome adversity." There was something in his tone that made Sarah's skin crawl, but she couldn't quite identify what. It was the practiced kindness of someone who'd learned to weaponize generosity. "Think about it," Christopher said, pushing off from the locker. We're always looking for new members, especially ones with interesting family histories. That night, Sarah sat in her small bedroom in Mark's modest colonial house, staring at the Students' Care Foundation flyer. Something nagged at her. A pattern recognition inherited from years of watching her father work. She opened her laptop and began researching, applying the skills Thomas had taught her during long summer afternoons when other kids were at camp. Wellington Medical Group operated 17 private hospitals and 32 outpatient clinics across Massachusetts. Dr. Richard Wellington, Christopher's father, had built the empire over 2 decades, specializing in cutting-edge treatments and innovative patient care solutions. The websites were polished, the patient testimonials glowing, the credentials impressive. But when Sarah started digging into the financial filings, using techniques her father had shown her, patterns began to emerge. Unusual billing codes, higher-than-average claim approval rates, treatment protocols that seemed to generate maximum insurance reimbursements rather than optimal patient outcomes. She pulled out the USB drive, hesitating only a moment before plugging it into her laptop. Her father's files opened like a door into his final investigation. Medical billing irregularities, insurance fraud red flags, shell companies receiving payments from major insurance providers. And at the center of it all, a network of private hospitals and clinics that seemed designed more for profit extraction than patient care. Wellington Medical Group appeared in her father's notes 47 times. Sarah's hands shook as she cross-referenced her father's files with Christopher's charity foundation. The Students' Care Foundation had raised over $600,000 in the past 2 years through various events. The money was supposed to go to disadvantaged students and medical assistance for families in need. But when Sarah traced the financial trail, using her father's methods, the donations seemed to disappear into a maze of administrative fees, processing costs, and management expenses. Very little actual money reached the intended recipients. Instead, significant portions were being transferred to medical billing companies, healthcare consulting firms, and administrative services corporations, companies that, according to her father's files, were suspected fronts for money laundering operations connected to healthcare fraud. Christopher Wellington wasn't just a bully who enjoyed tormenting scholarship students. He was running a sophisticated money laundering scheme disguised as teenage charity work. Sarah stared at the screen, feeling her father's presence in the methodical way the evidence lined up. Healthcare fraud had killed him. She was certain now. Not the car accident, not the hospital bills, but the investigation that had gotten too close to too much money. And now she was living on a scholarship provided by the same medical group her father had died investigating. She was attending school with the son of the man who might have ordered her father's death. She was being recruited to participate in the very money laundering operation that had destroyed her family. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Looking forward to working with you on Students' Care Foundation. Tomorrow after school. Conference Room B. Don't be late. Christopher. Sarah closed the laptop, her mind racing. She could run. Tell Mark they needed to leave Massachusetts, transfer her to another school. She could ignore what she'd discovered, focus on her education, pretend she'd never seen the pattern. Or she could do what her father would have done. She could follow the money, document the evidence, and finish the investigation that had cost Thomas Thompson his life. She looked at the USB drive, then at Christopher's text message. Tomorrow would begin the most dangerous game of her life. A 17-year-old scholarship student against $1 million medical fraud operation. With only her father's training and her own desperate need for justice. But Sarah Thompson had been raised by a man who taught her that when numbers don't add up, that's not a mistake, that's a choice. and she was about to make hers. The next afternoon, Sarah walked into Conference Room B carrying a notebook and wearing the same thrift store sweater that marked her as different from every other student at Millbrook Academy. Christopher was already there, along with 5 other students she recognized as the core of his social circle. Madison, from chemistry class, sat beside him, along with James Morrison, whose family owned a chain of pharmaceutical distribution centers, and 3 others whose parents were doctors, hospital administrators, or healthcare executives. "Sarah," Christopher said, gesturing to an empty chair across from him, "so glad you decided to join us." As she sat down, Sarah noticed that every student in the room came from families connected to the medical industry. This wasn't a random charity organization. This was a carefully selected group of teenagers whose parents all had access to healthcare billing systems, insurance claim processes, and medical record management. "Before we begin," Christopher said, "I need everyone to sign this confidentiality agreement. Students' Care Foundation handles sensitive information about the families we help, and we need to protect their privacy." He slid a legal document across the table. Sarah scanned it quickly, recognizing language that would prevent her from discussing anything she learned about the organization's operations. Her father had shown her similar contracts used by companies trying to hide financial irregularities. The other students signed without reading. Sarah hesitated, then carefully wrote her name, knowing that signing would give her access to the organization's inner workings. "Excellent," Christopher said, collecting the papers. "Now, let me tell you about our real work here." He clicked open a laptop and projected financial charts onto the conference room wall. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the sophisticated money flow diagrams her father used in his fraud investigations. Students' Care Foundation has raised over $600,000 in 2 years, Christopher began. But what we don't advertise is how efficiently we've learned to process charitable donations through medical billing systems. It's actually quite brilliant. Sarah forced her expression to remain neutral, as Christopher explained how the foundation collected donations for medical assistance, then transferred the money to shell companies that submitted insurance claims for services never rendered. The insurance companies paid out claims. The money was laundered through multiple accounts, and a portion was returned to the donors as tax-deductible charitable contributions. "Everyone wins," Madison said brightly. "Donors get tax breaks, insurance companies process claims, medical providers get reimbursed, and families in need get assistance." "What families in need?" Sarah asked quietly. Christopher's smile faltered for just a moment. "Well, we are very selective about our recipients. We have to be careful not to create dependency." James Morrison leaned forward. "My dad's distribution company handles pharmaceutical supplies for most of the medical providers in our network. We can track which medications are actually dispensed versus which ones are billed to insurance. It's amazing how much waste there is in the system." Sarah felt sick. They weren't just stealing money. They were manipulating medication distribution, potentially affecting real patients who needed real treatments. Her father's notes had mentioned suspicious pharmaceutical shortages that seemed to coincide with billing irregularities. "The beauty of our model," Christopher continued, "is that it's all legal. Charitable foundations are allowed to hire medical consulting services. Medical consulting services are allowed to submit insurance claims. Insurance companies are required to pay valid claims. We're not breaking any laws. We're just being creative about how different legal activities connect to each other." "But," Sarah said carefully, "what happens when insurance companies realize they're paying for services that were never actually provided to real patients?" The room fell silent. Christopher stared at her with new interest. "That's a very sophisticated question," he said slowly. "You must have learned something about insurance fraud from your father's work." Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her voice level. "He talked about his cases sometimes. I know insurance fraud is a federal crime that can carry decades in prison." "Only if you can prove intent to defraud," James said. "If claims are submitted in good faith based on documentation provided by medical professionals, then any errors are just administrative mistakes." Christopher nodded approvingly. "Exactly, and our documentation is always perfect. My father's hospitals maintain meticulous records. Every claim we submit has proper medical codes, appropriate diagnoses, qualified provider signatures. If insurance companies choose to pay those claims, that's their business decision." Sarah realized she was listening to the most sophisticated healthcare fraud operation she'd ever encountered, run by teenagers whose parents had taught them to exploit every loophole in the medical billing system. Her father's investigation had barely scratched the surface. "So," Christopher said, his eyes fixed on Sarah, "your role would be helping us identify potential recipients for our charitable assistance, students from disadvantaged backgrounds who might benefit from our foundation's support. You'd be perfect for that position, given your personal experience with financial hardship." Sarah understood now. They weren't recruiting her to help with charity work. They were recruiting her to identify vulnerable families who could be used as covers for fraudulent insurance claims. Students whose parents were desperate enough to sign paperwork without asking too many questions. "I'd need to think about it," Sarah said. "Of course," Christopher replied. "Take all the time you need. But remember, Sarah, Millbrook Academy has very high academic standards. Students who can't handle the social and extracurricular expectations sometimes find it difficult to maintain their scholarships." The threat was delivered with the same practiced smile he'd worn in chemistry class, but Sarah heard it clearly. Participate in the fraud operation, or lose her education and her family's chance at financial stability. That night, she sat in her bedroom staring at her father's files, finally understanding why Thomas Thompson had been killed. He hadn't just been investigating healthcare fraud. He'd been investigating a multi-generational criminal enterprise that involved some of the most powerful medical families in Massachusetts. Families whose children attended elite private schools, whose charitable foundations provided cover for money laundering, whose political connections reached into state and federal agencies. Christopher Wellington III wasn't just a privileged bully. He was the heir apparent to a $50 million criminal empire, being trained from adolescence to take over operations that defrauded insurance companies, manipulated medication distribution, and exploited vulnerable families. And Sarah Thompson, daughter of the federal agent who had died investigating that empire, was now sitting in the middle of their recruitment meeting, expected to help them identify new victims. She opened her laptop and began typing, documenting everything she'd learned, cross-referencing Christopher's explanation with her father's files, building the case that Thomas Thompson had died trying to complete. But as she worked, a new realization crept over her. Christopher had known exactly who she was from the first day of school. Wellington Medical Group had provided her scholarship not out of charity, but because they wanted to keep her close, monitor what she knew, and potentially use her father's death as leverage to ensure her cooperation. Sarah closed the laptop and lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to become complicit in the operation that had killed her father, or find a way to finish his investigation while surviving high school in the middle of enemy territory. Either way, her life as she knew it was over. The question was whether she would destroy the operation from within, or whether it would destroy her first. in the darkness. Sarah traced the outline of the USB drive one more time and whispered the words her father used to say, "When the numbers don't add up, that's not a mistake. That's a choice." Tomorrow, she would make hers. Sarah's decision came sooner than expected. 3 days after the Students' Care Foundation meeting, she walked into her AP Literature class to find her desk covered with printed copies of her family's bankruptcy filing from after her father's death. Christopher sat 2 rows away, not even trying to hide his satisfied smirk, as 20 students read through the detailed list of her family's debts. Medical bills, funeral costs, mortgage payments her mother couldn't make alone. Every private financial humiliation laid bare for teenage entertainment. "Looks like Thompson really needed that scholarship," someone whispered behind her. Sarah gathered the papers with steady hands. Though her face burned with shame, she'd expected retaliation for not immediately agreeing to help recruit vulnerable families. She hadn't expected Christopher to weaponize her father's death this efficiently. "Must be hard," Madison said with fake sympathy, "having everyone know your family's business like that." But as Sarah looked at the financial documents more closely, her father's training kicked in. These weren't just copies of public bankruptcy filings. They included private medical billing records, insurance claim details, and hospital invoices that should have been confidential under HIPAA laws. Christopher had accessed her father's medical records from his final hospitalization, records that would only be available to someone with high-level access to hospital billing systems. That afternoon, Sarah skipped lunch and went to the school library, using their computers to dig deeper into Wellington Medical Group's connections. What she found made her blood run cold. Thomas Thompson's final hospital stay had been at Wellington Memorial Hospital. His insurance claims had been processed through Wellington Healthcare Services. His medical records had been maintained in Wellington's electronic health system. Christopher's family hadn't just killed her father's investigation. They had controlled every aspect of his final medical care, watching him die while billing his insurance company for treatments that may or may not have been provided. Sarah printed the evidence and tucked it into her backpack, her hands shaking with rage and grief. She was no longer just investigating healthcare fraud. She was investigating her father's murder. The harassment escalated daily after that. Her locker was vandalized with "Charity Case" in permanent marker. Her car tires were slashed in the school parking lot. Students would loudly discuss welfare families whenever she walked by, making sure she heard every word. But the cruelest attack came during the annual college preparation assembly, when Christopher stood up during the financial aid presentation. "I have a question about scholarship fraud," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. "What happens when students lie on their applications about their family's financial situation?" The college counselor looked confused. "Well, scholarship fraud is a serious matter. Because I've heard some students exaggerate their hardships," Christopher continued, his eyes locked on Sarah. "Like claiming their parents died in accidents when really they committed suicide because of gambling debts, or saying they need financial aid when their families are actually hiding assets offshore." Sarah felt 400 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The lie was so specific, so cruel, that several students actually gasped. Christopher was publicly claiming that her father had committed suicide over gambling debts, that her family's financial struggles were fabricated. "Mr. Wellington," the counselor said sharply, "this isn't appropriate for a general assembly." But the damage was done. Sarah heard the whispers starting immediately. Students pulling out phones, probably already posting Christopher's accusations on social media. By the end of the day, Half the school would believe her father had killed himself over gambling debts, and that her scholarship was based on lies. That night, Sarah sat in her car in the school parking lot, crying for the first time since her father's funeral, not just from humiliation, but from the realization that Christopher could destroy her reputation, her education, and her family's future with carefully crafted lies that would spread faster than any truth. She was 17 years old, alone, fighting a battle against people who had unlimited resources and decades of experience destroying anyone who threatened them. But as she wiped her tears, Sarah remembered something her father used to say: "The best defense against lies is documentation. Truth leaves a paper trail." She opened her laptop and began the most important work of her life. For the next 3 weeks, Sarah became a different person. During the day, she endured the constant harassment with silent dignity, never responding to provocation, never giving Christopher the satisfaction of seeing her break. But every night, she worked like her father had taught her. She documented everything: screenshots of social media posts spreading lies about her family, audio recordings of Christopher's public humiliations, made with her phone hidden in her backpack, financial records showing how Students' Care Foundation money was being laundered through medical billing companies. Most importantly, she made contact with Agent Robert Kim from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. He had worked with her father and had been quietly monitoring Sarah's situation since Thomas's death. "Your father suspected he was getting close to something big," Agent Kim told her during a secret meeting at a coffee shop 30 minutes from Millbrook. "But he died before he could present his evidence to the grand jury. We've been waiting for someone to continue his work." Sarah handed over copies of everything she'd discovered: Christopher's detailed explanation of the fraud operation, financial records showing money flow from charitable donations to shell companies to insurance claims, medical billing irregularities that matched her father's original investigation. "This is enough for multiple federal indictments," Agent Kim said, studying the documents. "Healthcare fraud, money laundering, charitable organization fraud, tax evasion. But we need to move carefully. The Wellington family has significant political connections." "They killed my father," Sarah said quietly. Agent Kim nodded grimly. "We believe so. But proving murder is harder than proving fraud. Let's start with what we can prove and see where it leads." They developed a plan. Sarah would continue gathering evidence, particularly during the upcoming charity prom, where Christopher would be collecting donations and processing them through his fraudulent system. Agent Kim would coordinate with the FBI Healthcare Fraud Unit and the Massachusetts Attorney General's office to prepare simultaneous raids. The plan required Sarah to attend the charity prom, where Christopher would publicly present her with a charity dress purchased with funds from Students' Care Foundation. It would be the ultimate humiliation, but also the perfect opportunity to document the fraud in action. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Agent Kim asked. "What Christopher is doing to you psychologically, it's designed to break people. That's how they've silenced other victims." Sarah thought about her father, about the USB drive she still wore around her neck, about all the vulnerable families who would be exploited if this operation continued. "I can handle it," she said. "My father taught me that justice isn't about revenge. It's about stopping the people who hurt others." The night of the charity prom arrived like a reckoning. Sarah stood in her small bedroom, looking at herself in the mirror. She wore a simple black dress she'd bought from a consignment shop. Nothing fancy, but clean and appropriate. Around her neck, hidden beneath the neckline, hung the USB drive containing her father's final investigation, in her small purse. She carried a phone set to record audio, a backup USB drive with copies of all her evidence, and Agent Kim's business card. Tonight would either end Christopher's operation or destroy her completely. Millbrook Academy's gymnasium had been transformed into an elegant ballroom, with professional lighting, a live band, and tables covered in white linens. A banner across the stage read, "Students Care Foundation, Annual Charity Prom, Making Dreams Come True." Christopher stood near the entrance in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, greeting guests and their parents with practiced charm. When he saw Sarah, his smile became predatory. "Sarah Thompson," he announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Our special guest of honor." He gestured toward a table near the stage where a dress box sat with a large ribbon. "Ladies and gentlemen, this year's Students Care Foundation has done something extraordinary. We've provided a complete prom experience for a student who otherwise couldn't afford to attend." Sarah felt the familiar burn of public humiliation as every eye in the room turned toward her. Parents whispered to each other. Students pulled out phones to record. And she heard someone actually say, "How generous," in a tone that made charity sound like pity. "The dress was purchased through our foundation's Emergency Assistance Fund," Christopher continued, enjoying every moment of Sarah's discomfort. "Because we believe every student deserves to feel included, regardless of their family's financial circumstances." Sarah walked to the table, knowing this moment was being recorded from multiple angles. The dress box contained an elaborate gown that probably cost more than her stepfather's monthly salary, along with shoes, jewelry, and accessories that screamed charity case to anyone who understood the social dynamics at play. "Would you like to say a few words?" Christopher asked, gesturing toward the microphone, "to thank the generous donors who made this possible." This was the moment Agent Kim had prepared her for. Sarah walked to the microphone, looked out at the crowd of wealthy families and privileged students, and began to speak. "Thank you for this generous gift," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I want everyone here to understand exactly how Students Care Foundation works, because it's truly remarkable." And Christopher's smile faltered slightly, but he couldn't interrupt without seeming rude. "This foundation has raised over $600,000 in 2 years," Sarah continued, "through events just like this one, money that's supposed to help disadvantaged students and families with medical needs." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder of documents. "What's fascinating is how efficiently this money is processed through medical billing systems. For example, last month, Students Care Foundation transferred $40,000 to Wellington Healthcare Services for patient assistance programs. But when you look at the insurance claims submitted by Wellington Medical Group that same month, you find charges for medical procedures that were never actually performed." The room had gone completely silent. Christopher was staring at her with undisguised fury. But he couldn't move without confirming that everything she was saying was true. "Ghost patients," Sarah said, using the technical term her father had taught her. "Phantom procedures, billing codes for treatments that exist only on paper, generating insurance payouts that get laundered through charitable donations." She looked directly at Christopher. "It's actually brilliant. Use teenage charity events to collect donations. Transfer the money to shell companies connected to medical providers. Submit fraudulent insurance claims, and pocket the difference. Everyone assumes teenagers running charity events must be legitimate." Parents were pulling out phones, some to call lawyers, others to call law enforcement. Students were recording everything, realizing they were witnessing either the destruction of their school's golden boy or a scholarship student having a complete psychological breakdown. Christopher finally moved. walking quickly toward the microphone. "Sarah's been under a lot of stress lately," he said, trying to damage control. Financial hardship can really affect someone's mental health. But Sarah wasn't finished. "My father, Thomas Thompson, was a forensic accountant with IRS criminal investigation. He died while investigating this exact operation. His final case files contained evidence of healthcare fraud connected to Wellington Medical Group, totaling over $50 million. She held up the USB drive from around her neck. "Everything is documented: shell companies, money laundering, fraudulent insurance claims, tax evasion. The FBI Healthcare Fraud Unit and the Massachusetts Attorney General's office are reviewing the evidence right now." Christopher lunged toward her, but Agent Kim had anticipated this moment. Federal agents and state police entered the gymnasium from multiple entrances, moving quickly to secure the scene. "Christopher Wellington III," Agent Kim announced, showing his badge. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, money laundering, and violation of charitable organization statutes." The next few minutes were chaos. Parents demanded explanations, students screamed and cried, and Christopher was led away in handcuffs while shouting that Sarah had fabricated everything. But Sarah stood quietly at the microphone, watching justice finally catch up with the people who had killed her father. 3 months later, Sarah transferred to a public high school closer to home. Christopher had entered a plea agreement that would keep him in juvenile detention until he turned 18, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and community service at free medical clinics. Dr. Richard Wellington was in federal prison, awaiting trial on dozens of healthcare fraud charges. Wellington Medical Group had been disbanded, its assets frozen to pay restitution to insurance companies and patients who had been harmed by fraudulent treatments. Most of the Millbrook Academy students wanted nothing to do with Sarah after the scandal broke. Some blamed her for destroying their school's reputation. Others were simply afraid of getting involved in something so complicated and dangerous. But a few students, particularly the other scholarship recipients who had been quietly suffering Christopher's harassment for years, reached out to thank her. They understood what it meant to risk everything in order to stop something wrong from continuing. Sarah still wore her father's USB drive around her neck, but now it contained a new file, the complete investigation that had brought down a $50 million criminal enterprise and prevented countless vulnerable families from being exploited. The Thomas Thompson Memorial Scholarship was established with funds recovered from the fraud investigation, providing financial assistance for students interested in forensic accounting and financial justice careers. And every night before bed, Sarah would look at her father's picture and whisper the words he had taught her, "When the numbers don't add up, that's not a mistake, that's a choice." She had chosen justice, even when it cost her everything she thought she wanted, even when it meant standing alone against people with unlimited power and resources, even when it meant sacrificing her chance at fitting in for her responsibility to fight back. Some victories come with a price, but some prices are worth paying, especially when you're fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. Sarah Thompson had learned that lesson at 17. In a gymnasium full of wealthy families who thought charity meant giving poor kids expensive dresses while stealing millions from the healthcare system. She had also learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon against institutional corruption is a teenage girl who refuses to be intimidated. Armed with her father's training and her own unshakable sense of right and wrong, the investigation was over. The criminals were in prison. The fraud had been stopped. But Sarah's real education was just beginning. 5 years later, Sarah Thompson graduated summa cum laude from Boston University with degrees in forensic accounting and criminal justice. She accepted a position with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, working in the same office where her father had spent his final years. Her first day on the job. Agent Kim handed her a case file. "Healthcare fraud investigation," he said with a knowing smile. "Multi-state operation involving private hospitals and charitable organizations. Sound familiar?" Sarah opened the file and saw the same patterns her father had taught her to recognize unusual billing codes, suspicious donation flows, shell companies designed to launder money through legitimate medical services. "Some people never learn," she said, already mentally mapping the financial connections that would bring down another criminal enterprise. But this time, she wouldn't be working alone. The case would be handled by a team of federal agents, state investigators, and forensic accountants who had been trained to recognize the sophisticated schemes that targeted vulnerable patients and families. Sarah kept her father's USB drive in her desk drawer now, along with a photo of Christopher Wellington in his orange jumpsuit from juvenile detention, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that justice sometimes requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Her father had taught her to follow the money. Her own experience had taught her something equally important: following the money meant nothing unless you were willing to act on what you found. That afternoon, Sarah began her first professional investigation, knowing that somewhere in the numbers that didn't add up, families were being exploited and patients were being harmed. Time to make some choices.